Journal of the Association of Christian Economists, Number 1, Autumn 1985. Biblical Principles and Economic Theory, George N. Monsma, Jr., Calvin College. Part 4. Such a judgment is reinforced by the testimony of the prophets, who conveyed the Lord's condemnation upon Israel and Judah when they failed to exercise proper stewardship of their economic resources. The New Testament speaks less about justice or injustice of particular legal economic structures, perhaps because the people to whom it was primarily addressed had no control or influence over these. But it does continue the strong emphasis of the Old Testament on caring for the poor and being of service to those in need. Christ's teachings and actions show his concern for and aid to the poor. Near the beginning of his ministry, he said in the synagogue at Nazareth, quote, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." Luke 4. And when John the Baptist asked from prison if he is the Messiah, Jesus said, quote, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. And the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them." Matthew 11. Christ called his followers to lend to those from whom they could not expect repayment. Luke 6. And to invite to their feasts, quote, "the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind," unquote, who could not repay them. Luke 14. He told them he came, quote, "not to be served, but to serve," Matthew 20, and illustrated this graphically to them by washing their feet on the night he had his last supper with them. John 13. In fact, his whole life was a life of service to those who were poor in one way or another, culminating in his ultimate sacrifice for us on the cross. Christ calls all people to follow his example by giving their lives to service to others who are in need. It is clear from the teaching of Christ and the apostles that being of service to those with economic needs is an important part of the Christian life for those who have the resources which enable them to be of such service. In addition to the passages already cited, this is taught in Christ's account of the Last Judgment contained in Matthew 25, where the things that distinguished the sheep from the goats were whether they had fed the hungry, gave drink to the thirsty, welcomed the stranger, clothed the naked, and visited those in prison. Paul calls upon the Corinthian Christians to use their abundance to supply the need of other Christians. 2 Corinthians 8. And in 1 Timothy 6, he charges the rich, quote, "to do good, to be rich in good deeds, liberal and generous," unquote. James stresses the concern that should be shown toward the poor and calls the rich oppressors. James 1 and 5. And he uses aid for the poor to show that a living faith will be demonstrated through works. And John, in a very moving passage, tells us the source of our ability to serve others economically, and the example we are to follow. Quote, "By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But if any one has the world's goods, and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or speech, but in deed and in truth. 1 John 3. In the New Testament, as in the Old, the Lord calls people to work, using their labor to provide for their families and those who are in need. For example, we read in Ephesians 4, quote, "Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his hands, so that he may be able to give to those in need." Unquote. Since all are called to work to support themselves and their families, a just society must provide opportunities for this, at least over a period of time, as was done by the Mosaic laws. There is little direct discussion of the standards for a just income and wealth distribution in the New Testament. The requirements that the needs of the poor be met, and the call for families to work to support themselves, certainly puts limits on the degree of inequality for distribution of both income and wealth that is just. Because unless each family has a certain amount of income and wealth, the amounts varying with the conditions in their society, these things cannot be accomplished. Paul says that those who refuse to work should not eat, 2 Thessalonians 3. But there is no evidence that the market values of resources controlled and offered for use in the economy should determine the income received by a family. Paul also says that an equality of goods is desirable among Christians, 2 Corinthians 8. And the type of sharing that he called for was practiced within the early church, Acts 2 and 4. The governmental role in establishing economic justice, or more broadly, encouraging proper stewardship, is not, to my knowledge, addressed directly in the New Testament. But Paul does indicate in Romans 13 that rulers are God's servants for good, and for the restraint and punishment of evil, and there is no indication that the economic sphere is excluded in this. Nor is there any indication that the Old Testament commands to rulers to establish economic justice are cancelled in the New Testament era. In view of this, and in view of the fact that governments cannot be neutral with regard to distributions of income and wealth, because, e.g., they must establish some system of property rights, and these strongly influence the distribution of wealth and income, we must conclude that governments as well as individuals are still called upon to establish justice in their societies, and that Christians who have the opportunity to influence government actions should work to achieve justice through governments as well as by their private use of their resources.